Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to jump right into a question that I know is on a lot of your minds. Are my irregular periods just because of a super stressful month, or could it be pointing to something else? Yeah, this is the big question, right? And look, it's a totally valid thing to worry about. It can cause a ton of anxiety. So today, our whole goal is to get some real clarity on this by just looking at the facts.
All right, let's get into it. What we're going to do is unpack the science behind all this. We're going to separate the myths from the actual clinical facts. And we're going to start with the thing most of us blame first. You guessed it, stress.
So, how in the world can something like a rough week at work or, a personal struggle physically mess with your menstrual cycle? Well, it all boils down to one really powerful hormone.
Okay, so let's talk about cortisol. Think of it as your body's built-in alarm system. In little bursts, it's actually super helpful. It's what gets you ready for action. But when that stress just doesn't let up, when it's chronic, those high cortisol levels start to, well, interfere with your body's normal operations. And yeah, that absolutely includes your hormones.
So, here's the chain reaction, step by step. You get stressed out. Your cortisol levels shoot up. Now, that rise in cortisol messes with something called the HPA axis, which is basically the super important communication highway between your brain and your ovaries. And when that signal gets all staticky and fuzzy, the result is just hormonal chaos and a cycle that's all over the place. And what does that actually feel like? What does it look like in real life? Well, it can mean your period is late. It could mean you ovulate way later than you normally would. Or in some cases, you might even have what's called an anovulatory cycle. That's a whole cycle where your body doesn't even release an egg. It's wild, right? It's a direct physical response to what's going on in your head. Okay, so that's the deal with an external factor like stress. But what if the problem is coming from the inside? Let's totally shift gears now and talk about polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS. Now, PCOD isn't just a reaction to a bad month. This is a clinical condition, and it's rooted in a deep, fundamental hormone imbalance. And that imbalance directly leads to something called ovulatory dysfunction, which honestly is just a fancy way of saying your ovaries aren't releasing eggs on a regular, predictable schedule. It's a whole different ballgame. And this is where you can really see the core difference, right? A typical cycle has a rhythm. It's predictable. With PCOD, that predictability is just gone. It can lead to what doctors call oligomenorrhea, which just means you get your period very infrequently, or even amenorrhea, where periods stop altogether. See, it's a systemic thing, not just a temporary blip. Okay, this brings us to a super important point. And honestly, it's a really common myth that we've got to bust right now. You've probably heard it, or maybe even thought it yourself. You hear irregular periods, and your brain immediately jumps to, oh no, it must be PCOD. But the reality? It's just not that simple. That idea, as common as it is a total myth.
The truth is way more complex. I mean, we've already talked about stress being a huge one, but so are things like thyroid problems or big changes in your weight, up or down. Even just traveling can do it, or certain medications, or a really intense exercise routine. Any one of these things can throw your cycle completely off track.
Sometimes the best way to really get this stuff is to see how it plays out in a real person's life. So I want to share a story that shows how all these different puzzle pieces can actually fit together. So I have a friend who went through this. Her periods started getting really irregular after a few months of just insane stress. And at first she was like, it's just the stress, brushed it off. But then other things started showing up. Some acne, her moods were all over the place, and she was gaining weight she couldn't explain. It was that whole package of symptoms that kept sticking around that finally made her go, okay, I need to see a doctor. And after some tests, sure enough, she got a clear PCOD diagnosis. The good news is with some lifestyle changes, she was able to get her cycles back on track. And that's the key takeaway right there. The crucial point is that it wasn't just the irregular period. It was the persistent pattern of all these symptoms together that painted the full picture. That's what pointed to the right diagnosis. A single symptom can mean a million things, but a pattern tells a story. So, okay, where does this leave you? Let's wrap up by summarizing the key differences one more time and talk about the next steps for you to get some clarity on what's going on in your own body. Okay, let's break it down really simply. When you look at stress, the cause is external, right? It works through that cortisol hormone we talked about, and it's often temporary. It links up with how stressed you are. PCOD, on the other hand, that's an internal hormonal imbalance.
The mechanism is that ovulatory dysfunction, and the key thing to watch for is that it's persistent and usually comes with a crew of other symptoms.
And ultimately, all of this leads to a pretty personal question. What is your body telling you? Your body is sending you signals all the time. A single, one-off, irregular cycle? That might just be your body saying, hey, this month was rough. But a persistent pattern? That's a much deeper message. The real key here is knowing when it's time to pause, to really pay attention, and to actually listen to what your body is trying to tell you.